G. There is something that happens to a human being in the final moments before sleep that most people have never been told about. The noise of the day fades. G. The armor you wear, the productivity, the performance, the carefully managed version of yourself that you show to the world begins quietly to fall away. G. And in that vulnerable, unguarded space between wakefulness and rest, something extraordinary becomes possible. Scientists call it the hypnagogic state. G. Mystics and contemplatives across centuries called it the threshold. G. And what both traditions agree on, though they use very different words, is that in those final 10 minutes before sleep, the human mind is more open, more receptive, and more deeply connected to something beyond itself than at almost any other moment in the day. Now imagine what happens when you bring Jesus into that space. Not as a ritual, not as a religious obligation performed out of habit or guilt, but as a living, conscious, deeply personal encounter. Right there, in the quiet dark, at the edge of sleep, with the one who said, I am with you always. If something in you just stirred, a longing, a curiosity, maybe even a quiet ache for something you haven't been able to name, type the word heal in the comments right now. Because this video was made for exactly that feeling. And if you've ever gone to bed carrying more than you should have to carry alone, the weight of a relationship that is breaking, a body that is tired beyond rest, a heart that has been hoping for something to change for a very long time, please stay. What you are about to discover has been quietly transforming lives for 2000 years. Like this video if you believe that healing is still possible, because it is. And the door to it may be closer than you have ever imagined. Here is what most people miss. Sleep is not simply a biological function. It is not merely the body shutting down to recharge like a machine plugged into a wall. Every ancient tradition that has ever reflected seriously on the nature of human existence has understood sleep as something far more sacred than that. It is a surrender, a letting go, a nightly act of trust in something greater than yourself. And those 10 minutes before that surrender, those final, tender, liminal moments may be the most spiritually significant 10 minutes of your entire day. Tonight, we are going to explore what it means to spend them with Jesus. What shifts in a person who does? What healings, physical, emotional, and spiritual, have been described by those who have made this a practice? And what ancient wisdom, modern science, and the quiet testimony of countless lives all point to when it comes to the mysterious, miraculous power of what happens in the heart during those sacred moments before sleep. Stay with us, because what comes next might change the way you go to bed forever. G. Long before the modern world reduced sleep to a productivity metric, something to optimize, to track with devices, G. To compress into the smallest number of hours possible, ancient civilizations understood that the night was holy. In the ancient Near East, G. The hours of darkness were not simply the absence of light, they were a different kind of presence. G. A time when the boundary between the visible and invisible world grew thin. When the soul, released from the demands of waking life, became capable of receiving what the noise of the day had drowned out. The Hebrew tradition spoke of God granting wisdom and revelation during the night hours. The Psalms are filled with this understanding. Poets and prophets who found that their deepest encounters with the divine did not happen in the marketplace or the palace, but in the stillness of the night watch. I remember you upon my bed, wrote the psalmist, and meditate on you in the watches of the night. This was not poetry for poetry's sake. This was the testimony of a soul that had discovered something real in the darkness. And this understanding was not confined to one tradition or one corner of the ancient world. Across cultures and centuries, the liminal space before sleep was treated with a reverence that the modern world has almost entirely forgotten. It was a time for reflection, for release, for conscious surrender of the day's burdens into hands greater than one's own. The early Christian contemplatives carried this understanding forward with extraordinary depth. The practice of compline, the final prayer of the day in ancient monastic tradition, was built entirely around this insight. Before sleep, the monks would gather in the candlelit silence of the chapel, release the failures and sorrows of the day, and consciously place themselves in the hands of God before closing their eyes. They were not performing a ceremony. They were making an intentional choice about what to carry into the night, and more importantly, what to lay down, what they understood. Through centuries of practice and spiritual wisdom, was that the soul does not fully rest when it carries unresolved weight into sleep. That grief, fear, guilt, and unforgiven pain do not simply pause when the eyes close. They continue their quiet work beneath the surface, shaping dreams, disturbing rest, and returning with the morning sun no lighter than when the night began. But something different happened. They discovered when the final moments before sleep were spent in conscious, sincere encounter with Jesus. When the burdens were named aloud, or simply held up in silence and offered into his hands. When the heart, instead of rehearsing tomorrow's anxieties or replaying today's wounds, turned deliberately toward the one who had said, "Cast all your anxiety on me, because I care for you." The rest that followed, they reported, was qualitatively different. Not merely deeper in a physical sense, though many described that too, but different in a way that touched something beneath the physical. Their work changed in ways they could not always explain, softened, clearer, carrying a quietness that had not been there the night before. Modern sleep science, centuries later, has begun to offer a language for what these contemplatives were experiencing. Research into the hypnagogic and hypnopompic states, the threshold moments at the edges of sleep, has confirmed that these are periods of unusual neurological receptivity. The brain in these transitional states processes emotional material differently. Trauma can shift, grief can move. Patterns held rigid in waking consciousness become briefly fluid. In other words, what you bring to the threshold of sleep matters profoundly. It does not simply disappear into the night. It is processed, integrated, and in some mysterious way answered. The ancient monastics did not have the language of neuroscience, but they had something perhaps more valuable: centuries of careful, disciplined, first hand observation of what actually happens to a human soul that learns to end each day in the presence of Jesus. and what they observed, recorded, and passed down through generations of spiritual writing is nothing less than extraordinary. So, what actually happens when you spend those final 10 minutes before sleep, consciously, deliberately, in the presence of Jesus? Let us begin with the body. G. Because healing, real healing, is never only spiritual, it moves through the physical. It touches the nervous system, the breath, the heartbeat, G, the chemistry of the blood. And what happens physiologically in those 10 minutes, when practiced with sincerity and stillness, G, is something that science and scripture both point toward with remarkable agreement. G. When a person lies down in the darkness and consciously turns their attention toward Jesus, not with striving, not with performance, but with simple G, open surrender, the body begins to respond almost immediately. The breath slows. The muscles, G, which have been held in low grade tension since the moment the alarm sounded that morning, begin to release. The nervous system, G, which has spent the entire day in a state of vigilance and readiness, begins its shift from activation toward rest. This is not imagination. This is physiology. But here is what makes the 10 minutes before sleep with Jesus different from simply practicing relaxation techniques before bed. Relaxation techniques calm the body, but they leave the soul untouched, and it is the soul, the deep interior life, the place where your truest fears and your most unspoken longings live, that carries the weight that disrupts rest. The weight that wakes you at 3 in the morning with a racing heart and a mind full of things you cannot resolve. The weight that makes you tired even after 8 hours of sleep because something beneath the sleep was never truly at rest. Jesus addressed this directly and without complexity. He did not offer a philosophy. He did not prescribe a technique. He simply said, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Not the rest of unconsciousness, not the rest of distraction, but rest for the soul. A different category of rest entirely. One that touches the places that sleep alone cannot reach. There is an ancient story, quiet, almost forgotten, of a man who had carried a particular grief for 11 years, the grief of a lost child. The kind of sorrow that settles into the bones and becomes so familiar that a person stops expecting it to ever lift. He had prayed, he had sought counsel, he had done everything that could reasonably be done. And still, every night, the grief was there at the edge of sleep, waiting for him. A monk he encountered suggested something simple, not a new theology, not a complicated practice, just this. In those final minutes before sleep, instead of bracing against the grief or trying to think his way through it, he was to simply imagine laying it down. Physically, concretely, in his mind, placing it at the feet of Jesus, the way the broken and the burdened had done in the Gospels, and then resting, not waiting for an answer, not demanding a resolution, just resting in the presence of the one he had placed it with. He tried it that night, and the next, and the one after that. On the seventh night, something shifted. He could not explain it in theological terms. He could not point to a specific moment or a specific word. But when he woke the following morning, the grief, which had been a stone in his chest for 11 years, had moved, not disappeared. but moved. G. As though something in the night, in that surrendered space, had touched it in a way that nothing else had been able to reach. G. This is the testimony that echoes across Christian history with quiet, persistent consistency. Not always dramatic, not always immediate, but real, deeply G, unmistakably real. Because what happens when a soul genuinely surrenders its weight into the hands of Jesus before sleep is not merely psychological comfort. G. Something moves in the invisible architecture of a person's life. Something shifts in the deep interior place where healing actually originates, not from the outside in G, but from the inside out. The Gospels are filled with people who came to Jesus carrying things they had carried for years. A woman who had been ill for 12 years. G. A man who had been paralyzed for 38. Blindness, grief, shame, isolation, conditions that had resisted every other remedy. And again, G. The encounter with Jesus did not follow predictable patterns. It did not require perfect faith or perfect understanding. It required only one thing: coming, G. Turning toward Him, bringing what was broken and placing it in His presence. That same invitation has not expired. And the threshold of sleep, that tender, unguarded, G, luminous edge between waking and rest, may be the most natural place in all of daily life to accept it. But there is a dimension to this practice that goes beyond healing, G, beyond the release of grief and the quieting of anxiety, something that the contemplative tradition has spoken of in hushed, G, almost reverent tones, because it touches a territory of human experience that ordinary language struggles to contain. It is the territory of miracles, G, not miracles as spectacle, not miracles as the dramatic, undeniable interventions that make headlines or fill stadiums, but miracles in the older, G, deeper sense of the word, from the Latin miraculum, meaning something that causes wonder, something that arrives from beyond the boundaries of what seemed possible, G, something that shifts the course of a life in ways that cannot be fully accounted for by logic or circumstance alone, G, and the contemplative witnesses of Christian history, men and women who spent lifetimes in disciplined, careful, G, honest observation of the interior life, returned again and again to the same extraordinary claim that the hours of sleep, G, when entered consciously in the presence of Jesus, become a space where something moves that does not move in waking life, G, where prayers offered at the threshold of sleep seem to carry a peculiar weight, G, where surrenders made in that unguarded moment seem to open doors that years of striving had left closed. G. Saint John of the Cross, the 16th century Spanish mystic whose writings on the interior life remain among the most penetrating ever produced, described the soul in sleep as a field that has been plowed and left open, G, receptive in a way that the defended, effortful waking mind rarely allows. And into that open field, he suggested, G, something could be planted that the waking mind would never have permitted entry. This is not mystical escapism. This is a serious, G, careful observation about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the divine, G. And modern understanding of sleep science adds a quietly astonishing layer to this ancient insight, G. During the deep stages of sleep, particularly the slow wave sleep that the body enters in the first half of the night, The brain undergoes a process of profound consolidation and reorganization. G. Memories are sorted. Emotional experiences are processed and integrated. The neural pathways that govern belief, expectation, and habitual response are quietly rewritten in ways that waking effort alone cannot achieve. In other words, the night is not passive. The sleeping mind is not idle. G. It is doing some of the most important work of a human life. G. And what you bring to the threshold of that work, what you plant in those final 10 minutes before the deep processes of sleep take over, shapes what the night does with what it has been given. G. This is why the practice of spending 10 minutes with Jesus before sleep is not simply comforting. It is, in the most literal sense, transformative. G. Because you are not merely calming your nervous system before bed, you are seeding the night. You are placing something into the most receptive, most integrative, most mysteriously powerful hours of your existence, and trusting the one you have placed it with to do what waking effort could not. The testimonies of those who have practiced this with consistency and sincerity across the centuries share a quality that is difficult to dismiss. They speak of circumstances shifting in ways they did not engineer, of relationships that had been frozen for years suddenly beginning to thaw, of physical conditions that had resisted treatment improving in ways that surprised their physicians, of creative solutions to problems that had seemed intractable arriving fully formed with the morning light, of a quiet but persistent sense that something was working on their behalf in the night, something gentle, something unhurried, something that operated according to a logic far deeper than the logic of effort and control. Brother Lawrence, that humble, extraordinary monk whose kitchen prayers became a classic of Christian literature, wrote that he had come to trust the nights as deeply as the days. G. That he had learned to believe that what he surrendered before sleep was not lost in the darkness, but held, tended, quietly returned to him in the morning changed. G. This is the miracle that the contemplative tradition points to. Not a miracle that bypasses human experience, but one that moves through it. G. Through the vulnerability of sleep, through the openness of a surrendered heart, through the mysterious, faithful, G. unhurried work of a presence that does not rest, even when we do. And it begins with 10 minutes. 10 intentional, sincere, open hearted minutes at the edge of the night. G. What you bring to those minutes matters. What you choose to do with that threshold, that sacred G. Fleeting space between the day and the dark may matter more than anything else you do before closing your eyes. So, how does this actually look in practice? G. How does a person, ordinary, tired, perhaps skeptical, G, perhaps deeply hoping, actually spend 10 minutes with Jesus before sleep in a way that opens the door to healing and to the quiet work of miracles? G. The answer is simpler than you might expect, and that simplicity is itself part of the wisdom. You do not need a script. G. You do not need a perfectly structured prayer or a theological framework or the right sequence of words. G. What you need is what the people in the Gospels brought to Jesus, nothing more and nothing less than yourself, exactly as you are, exactly where you are, in the dark, in the quiet, in the honest truth of whatever this particular day has left you carrying, begin by lying. Still, not trying to sleep, not scrolling, G. Not reviewing the day's failures or rehearsing tomorrow's demands. Simply still and take 3 slow, deliberate breaths, not as a technique, but as an act of intention, G. A physical signal to your body and your soul that something is shifting, that you are moving consciously from the noise of the day into a different kind of space. Then, G. In whatever way feels natural to you, simply turn your attention toward Jesus, not toward an idea of Him, not toward a theological construct, but toward a presence, warm, G. Patient, completely unhurried, and already there, already in the room, already aware of everything you are carrying before you have said a single word. You might speak, G. You might name quietly and honestly what the day held. The fear that showed up unexpectedly. The conversation that left a bruise. G. The hope that is still waiting to be answered. The body that is tired in ways that sleep alone has not been reaching. Bring it, all of it, without editing. G. Without performing. Without trying to sound sufficiently faithful or sufficiently grateful, just honest, just real. G. And this is the part that transforms the practice from petition into encounter. Let yourself receive. Stop, stop speaking. Stop asking. G. And simply rest in the awareness of being known, being held. G. Being in the presence of a love that does not require you to be anything other than what you are in this moment. G. If words come to mind from scripture, let them settle over you like a blanket. He grants sleep to those he loves. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. G. I will lie down and sleep in peace, for you alone make me dwell in safety, not as recitation, but as living reality. G. As a description of what is actually happening in this room, in this moment, in this quiet act of trust. Stay in that space for as long as feels natural. 5 minutes. G. 10 minutes. Let the boundary between prayer and sleep become soft and gradual, because that softness is itself a form of surrender. G. You are not ending the prayer and then going to sleep. You are allowing the prayer to carry you into sleep. G. Allowing the presence you have turned toward to be the last thing your conscious mind rests in before the deeper work of the night begins. Do this with consistency, not perfectly, not without distraction, but with returning the same gentle, faithful returning that the contemplatives practiced, night after night. G. Not demanding results on any particular timeline, but trusting that something is happening, that the night is not empty. G. That the presence you have turned toward does not leave when your eyes close. G. Because here is what those who have practiced this long enough have discovered. The mornings begin to change. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, G, unmistakably. A quietness that was not there before, a resilience that cannot be fully explained by the hours of sleep, a sense subtle but persistent, G, that something in the night has been at work, that you were not alone in the dark, that the weight you laid down before sleep is somehow mysteriously, G, lighter in the light of the new day.